your permission, I will draw two little Lacanian diagrams. I belong to a category where others, in fact, French or Francophile or Franco-light philosophers in the world, but not Lacanians. They are official Lacanians.
No, no, io vado via per vado via, vado.
Eloquence of that. To some extent. And I belong to another category that is somebody who's not a Lacanian, because all my life I've been struggling with Lacan. Of course, I heard him when I was a student, and believe it or not, when he spoke, although he was famous for his very esoteric, elliptic, and way of speaking, it was much clearer than when you try and read him, even the transcriptions of the text. Yes, because something to do with what I was talking about a moment ago. Because not only because he was eloquent, but because there was a dynamic, a movement, like in the oral speech, that somehow re-established the hierarchy among the syntactic hierarchy among words and signifiers, without which you cannot understand what somebody wants to say. So, but in any case, as I said, I struggled all my life with some of the ideas, but there are a few instruments, I would say, formal instruments, which I repeatedly come back to. And one of them is not the main one, of course, is the well-known Borromean, the so-called Borromean knot. Now, what I will present here is not exactly a Borromean knot, because it's just a Pierce diagram of three intersecting circles or sums. The actual Borromean knot, as you probably know, and it's very easy to make, is a conjunction of three circles, or maybe one, of course, which are intertwined in such a manner as if any one of them is cut or made loose, the whole thing falls apart. And so each of them binds the other two, or keeps them together. This is no topological, of course, no way it was discovered, topological figure or shape. And it's called like that, as you perhaps know, because the knot, so you have to imagine that the first is like this, and then the second overlaps on one side, and then is under the first then, and then the third one does the same with each and every of them. So I should know how to make it inside. So this is called Borromean knot because it features famously on the arms, or you say arms, of the very ancient aristocratic family from northern Italy, the Borromei, the ones who had bows and ewes and all that in their nationality, and who in particular built the unbelievable castle in the lake Lago Maggiore in northern Italy called Isola. No. Okay, so the Borromean knot, which I draw in a slightly simplified manner, is made of three circles, each of which is mediating, I would say, or connecting the other. And as Lacan
Grazie, prego.
explained when he introduced this representation, this can be used to speculate and reflect on ontological properties. There's no other way than that, of systems or structures which are not, that's the important point, which are not dualistic, as many of our traditional ontological structures are. Form and matter, subject and object, real and virtual. We seem to be completely unable to move outside such antithesis. Of course, if you want to be, can you follow me? If you want to be critical of this kind of ontology, or in other terminologies that I take them to be more or less synonymous in this case, semantic universes or transcendental forms of reflection, there are different ways of doing it. To remain, I apologize for that, within the French contemporary tradition, which I never called French theory. I absolutely hate this, this philosophy. So if you remain within this tradition, you have the Derridian way of doing it. The Derridian way called deconstruction, to put it in a very simple way, I use it at the end of my paper, means that you take certain binaries or certain antitheses, which again are supposed to be ultimate or impossible to dismiss, to overcome, and you start showing not only that they are indeterminate or uncertain, as they do in my paper, but that they are impossible, because in fact they implicitly and inevitably at some point reveal something like a sacrament. Derrida's something that is in excess, an element without which they would not work, but which in fact destroy or disturbs their beautiful symmetry. In Lacan's case, of course, he's not a deconstructor. He's in a sense exactly the opposite. The method takes the form of imposing, and of course this also has a long speculative tradition behind itself, another kind of semantics or ontology, which right from the beginning is ternary. Of course, well, that's a long story. We might say there is a theological background behind that, except that, yes, of course, I mean, our God in the Christian tradition is a Trinity, so it must have something to do with that, but leave that aside. And in Lacan's famous presentation, that's the ontological dimension he's giving to it, the three realms, these are realms, or codes, if you like, are called respectively the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic, in whichever order. This is interesting because at the beginning, Lacan apparently had established a kind of absolute primacy of the symbolic in the form of the thesis of the declaration. The symbolic order is made of signifiers. The typical, the root for all that is language itself. And outside, of course, the codes and the practice of language, and therefore the symbolic as such, or the assemblage of signifiers, there is nothing to be either seen or thought, etc. But then it became interestingly more symmetric. Now, forgive this, if you can. I started to notice at some point that I had an irresistible tendency to work with triplets, if you like. And today we have to do with two of them. Of course, one is explicitly there in the title of my paper, one I gave years ago, British Association, so that leaving aside real symbolic and imaginary, because drawing direct correspondences would be something impossible. I might say that the object of this paper, formally speaking, very, very formally, of course, leaving aside what perhaps makes all the interest of what I tried to discuss, that is political matters, ethical matters, absolutely, ontological matters as well. This is, again, a kind of Borromean knot. Equal liberty as a political and juridical principle, anthropological difference as a philosophical problem, and also, of course, this is totally an anthropological one, and ontological difference as a way of indicating how, on the tracks of Heidegger and beyond Heidegger, perhaps with the help of Heidegger, you can try and move from an ontology of substances, which still heavily dominates substances and property. Of course, the center of the traditional ontology, which Derrida never ceases to attack, is the idea that something has to be properly what it is, become appropriated to itself, and for that reason, appropriable also by others. So moving from there to so-called ontology of relations, which proves, of course, to be a difficult question. Now, the only thing I want to say now, because we'll come to that in the questions that have been prepared, and I have a lot of, I hope, questions to answer, for which I'm not sure I have the answers. That's not a problem for me, it might be a problem for a workshop which aims at delivering some results. But the other thing that I want to draw from this, and it comes to my mind inevitably, of course, when looking at the title that Soraya and her colleagues have given to this workshop, is the fact that it has three notions: translation, hospitality, translation, hospitality, and equal liberty. Let's write it like that for the time being, words. Maybe at some point I have, in a minute I have the possibility to return to the etymology and the reasons why I coined this portmanteau. Is that a Borromean knot? That would be my first formal question, and in which sense? If we keep the same principle that I proposed a minute ago, it would mean something like each of these three notions, or perhaps questions in the form of notions, is necessary in order to articulate the other two. So we cannot talk about translation and hospitality, articulate translation and hospitality, without a notion like equality, and you can continue with the same game. Now, what's the sake of that? What's the interest of that? I think I can say two things about that. First of all, of course, what comes to my mind is the fact that Soraya and her colleagues have set up a wonderful program, which has a very long but also remarkable title. It's somewhere here called a project called Cosmopolitanism, Justice, Democracy, and Citizenship, the border triplet. cosmopolitanism. So, but the idea that comes to our mind is that she wants us and me in particular to talk about these three notions because she believes that their articulation is crucial to understand what the idea of cosmopolitanism can mean. Or perhaps, to put it slightly differently, given the tensions that ever since this word was invented by the Greeks, another problem, cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitan, such an articulation of three terms might be necessary in order to elucidate what is at stake in these tensions. Remarkably, of course, there never was in any period, and I'm sure she's said that several times, a single notion of cosmopolitanism or the cosmopolitical subject. This was always there in the form of at least a conflict or an antithesis between two rival, I would say, understandings, and perhaps more. Examples for that, if we return to the Greek, the originary clash or difference between the Stoic concept of cosmopolitanism and the cynical concept of cosmopolitanism, one of which has to do with, I would say, conservative, the potentially imperial representation of the unity of the world, its inhabitants, and the other one having to do, reason why it fascinated people in the last years of his life, with a negative, anarchist position, where to declare as a citizen of the world exactly means I'm not a citizen of this or that city, nation, if you prefer, state within which you want to be. But then when you come to the modern times and the idea of cosmopolitanism is resurrected, as you know, starting more on this than me, but on this at least we agree. We spoke about that some time ago. You have a very interesting tension between, I would say, 2 plus 1 notions of cosmopolitanism. You have the Kantian notion, of course, of use cosmopolitics, which, wrote 2 books, in fact, which is centered on the notion of hospitality or a certain understanding and valorization of the notion of hospitality, which was taken up again by contemporary philosophers, and once again, there is one of them, which is not the only one. He focused a certain discussion because he advanced the idea of unconditional hospitality, which a lot of people deem to be nuts, impossible, not desirable, which retrospectively seems to indicate that Kant's notion of hospitality was itself conditional rather than unconditional, something which is not clear at all. And then, Soraya is correct me as soon as I say something wrong, is the antithetic understanding that was proposed, in fact, in the same period, later by the Humboldt, they're not twins, the Humboldts, the 2 brothers, Alexander and Wilhelm, who, for the sake of this short presentation, we take as not only as twin figures, but as, say, complementary sides of one and the same idea. What is that idea? That's an idea which has to do, of course, with the valorizing the multiplicity of human languages and human cultures, themselves understood something very today as forms of relationship of the human with respect to or towards its environment. Of course, what is paradoxically valorized from this perspective is the very idea of multiplicity. The idea of multiplicity, and particularly the reason why the Humboldt fathers have been so influential in the whole anthropological tradition that includes Boas, and others. The anti-evolutionist idea that, in fact, there is no such thing as a linear process of evolution, meaning that some cultures provide the standard both for the understanding and the valorization of others. Of course, inevitably, that standard culture is the Western European one. So this might be perhaps quickly summarized in the form of bringing into the, it's not a neologism, but the bizarre, say, counter signifier. Apparently was invented, not entirely sure of that, during the same period by the great German poet Novalis, multiversum, and was, of course, is now of wide use, but it's of wide use in multiversum, wide use by different types of theorists, discourses. On one side, cosmologists, not by chance, of course, theoretical.
C'è una correzione rispetto all'ordine qua, sono diventate
logical words and which do not obey the same logical rules. And finally, of course, the anthropological idea that because this multiplicity of cultures cannot be subsumed under a single description or organized according to a single standard, what we call the universe, in fact, will be a multiverse. Then this calls for perhaps in addition to the two, the third one, which is Marx, and more generally the tradition, the socialist tradition, the socialist and communist tradition of the 19th, 20th century. Will it last in the 21st? That's an interesting question. And as you know, Marx's brand of cosmopolitanism, which does, of course, owes something to the others, if only in the form of reaction to them, it's called internationalism, which in some time, for Italian, he didn't coin it, internationalism. So the important element here being perhaps that if Kant's idea of hospitality is a teleological one, which aims at the realization in history or in human society of a certain idea or ideal. And the Humboldts, who have a very strong Leibnizian background, as they did later, of course, are apparently guided by the idea of a certain harmony that the world, the multiplicity of the world represents. Of course, in the case of Marx, the central idea is conflict. It's conflict and antagonism. Now, from all this, I derive, and I stop there because I probably speak too much, I derive the assumption, the hypothesis that the reason why Soraya put the three terms was that she wanted to, once again, to problematize that she wanted to problematize the question of cosmopolitanism, not just to, of course, not to simply achieve or produce a formal definition that would finally put an end, if you like, to the traditional conflicts or divergences. Rather, of course, and that's the very stake of the idea of problematizing or problematization, to understand what is at stake in their positions and why they cannot simply becomes reduced to one another. A kind of aphoretic way of doing theory of philosophy, which some people like and others hate, of course, because it doesn't seem to reach the kind of workable and usable conclusions that are expected. But then it seems to me that she had another reason to do that, which is that history of ideas is okay. The history of ideas is important. That reading the text and putting them in their right historical framework is always very useful. But it's more important, in a sense, to get closer, I would say, to the core of the aporias or even the antinomies that lie at the heart of a certain crucial idea or category. And in that case, if you let me, that's my guess. I'm trying to send her an inverted message. Let's see if she isn't that. My guess is that the theoretical issue at stake is universality. Is the form in which, the ways in which today we deal with the question of universality. And of course, what is interesting here is the fact, one, that conflict about universality, universalism, whether to reject it or to adopt it, but above all, of course, how to understand it and use it is central in many debates in today's world. It questions Europe's self-awareness or self-understanding of its own history, and sometimes seems to confront the European tradition and language of which we are part here, of course, with something like an all or nothing alternative. Either because the European idea of universality is completely, I would say, compromised. I mean, it's, with Eurocentrism, and therefore through Eurocentrism and imperialism, imperialism itself, and therefore the radical devalorization and misunderstanding of other cultures that you can call racism in the theoretical sense of the term. The only possibility to engage the other, I would say, perhaps with capital O, is to drop the idea of universality. But then, of course, when you talk to the other, those who speak in the name of the others, you discover sometimes, not always, discover sometimes that their point of view is not to call for the destruction or abandonment of the idea of the universal. It's rather to call for a radical transformation of our understanding and use of that category. So disentanglement, so to speak, of Eurocentrism and universalism. In this strategy, there are many differences, of course. Kant and Marx are probably the most Eurocentric of the three, but might be discussed. And then, of course, you get to the, I suggest, you get to the idea that what we need in the most literal sense of the term, even if I seem to be quoting the other day, again, is a deconstruction of the idea of universalism or the universal as a cultural and political motto. What are its components and how are they combined together. And it's here, of course, that the trilogy becomes interesting. The case, and again, I will repeat the Borromean motto: you cannot make use of any two of them without including the third. And you might believe that this is a way to justify my coinage and introduction of the small formula equilibrium. That's not, I hope, the case entirely. Now, all three of them are totally problematic, and I will finish with that. Hospitality is problematic, and that's the virtue, I believe, of Derrida's radical formulation, unconditional hospitality, which I take to be meaningful if you hear it, not in some indeterminate intellectual atmosphere, as if we were dealing with the idea of hospitality per se, but it's in a given conjuncture. The conjuncture in which we are, especially in Europe today. Just look at Lesbos this morning, and our it's not a situation in which you ask, abstractly speaking, whether an unconditional hospitality could be possible. It's a situation in which you face a claim of hospitality which is not only conditional, but in fact reversed into very violent in hospitality. So that you have to negate the negation. But the core of that is something that comes from Kant. Because, of course, Kant put severe limitations on his concept. He was, in fact, colonialist. Severe limitations on his concept of hospitality by, in particular, explaining the famous formula that the right of hospitality should be limited to visiting the other people's country, which is not the same, of course, as settling there as an immigrant. But at the core of his formula is a formula, as his discourse, the formula that I find more than ever absolutely crucial idea. Therefore, I have no difficulties in claiming to be attention from this point of view, which is the injunction not to treat the foreigner or the stranger or the foreigner as an enemy. And we live today in a situation in which increasingly the foreigner or some foreigners, certain foreigners, are automatically treated as enemies, even in an anti-category manner, which shows how relevant this is. Now, more rapidly, of course, the question with translation is, I believe, double. It's double because, on the one hand, you cannot avoid the question. There are increasingly many discourses which explain that traditional universalism and Eurocentric universalism, it was bound with colonization, imperialism. Perhaps the French, especially typical of that, more than the British colonialism. It's horrible. The French feel, of course, but the French, as we know, because they have proclaimed the Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Rights of Man, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is typically a universalistic text, thought of themselves, keep thinking of themselves to an incredible degree as the inventors of the modern and enlightened idea of the universal, and therefore somehow this private owner, which is a reflection in terms, of course. So against this homogenizing and violently unifying representation of the universal, there's a broad tendency to which many of us have contributed, and which has interesting overlapping with post-colonialism or certain forms of post-colonialism. I'm thinking of Balibar located lectures and others whom we could mention, which aims at introducing not only the idea of a universal made of its own internal differences, which is Humboldtian in a broad sense. So, but a universal that is achieved or produced through the labor of translation. The labor of translation not only in as much as it connects or binds together different languages and universes, and therefore makes them more or less not never interchangeable, communicable, but above all the Benjaminian idea that the process of translation is not is always at the same time a process of transformation of the languages themselves. So the one, the first, and above all the second, into which something is translated. Now this is very nice. This is very nice, and I like that, and I adhere to that very strongly. But it has several intrinsic problems. One of them being how do we translate the very word, the very expression universal into other non-Latin languages. And I believe this is an increasingly important issue. And the second, of course, being how do we combine, not to say reconcile, I would say the peaceful element, the idea that translation is a privileged practice of recognition, of mutual recognition, with the fact that cultures and languages in today's world, and for not forever perhaps, for a long time, never are in a relationship of equality. Not from afar. So their relations are conflictual, and they always involve different forms of domination. So that if you the harmony, there is one, it's not a prerequisite. What is the prerequisite is a different country. It can only be a problematic point. Right. That's where, of course, perhaps into looking into both directions, notion like equal liberty can become of some interest. Theoretically speaking, or repeating what I had said before, you're not about to combine. These are two very different ideas. The universalism of differences in translation, I would say, and the universalism of more or less unconditional universality, hospitality, which I think it means that by all means we preserve the vital element, existence of strangeness or foreignness in our cultures, while at the same time continuously rejecting the transformation of the foreign or the stranger into enemy. Now, of course, equal liberty is more private of my own. There were two sources for that, logically speaking. And it was, in a sense, the collapsing of the two that gave me this worth what it was. The first is that there is a long line, which I'm tempted to call constitutional, the history of political discourse in the West, in our culture. So Roman, essentially, post-Roman and Latin culture, which make use of that binary. So that, of course, derives from fundamental categories of Roman law, or better, Roman public law, equum ius, or or equa libertas, which you find in Cicero and others, and all the way out, it reaches it's never there. Great American just a series of Ross. Which is Ross, who makes an explicit use of liberty. The more I was reading him, with some effort, because he's not really funny, so the more I was reading him, the more I was surprised, and I thought that this is not really different from the Roman, of course, but by the fact that what he wanted to explicitly base on the use of this formula was the idea that we must at all costs establish a hierarchy between the two values or the two categories, because the situation is such that you can always give up or drop some of your demands on equality, but never your demands on liberty. Because if you destroy liberty, you will not have equality, whereas if you destroy equality, more or less, you will keep liberty, which I think is totally wrong. So, especially obviously wrong in our contemporary situation. So what clinched in a sense and produced the idea was the fact that at the same time I was rereading the text from the English Revolution, particularly the levelers. A lot can be said about the levelers. But among the tracks of the levelers, a friend of mine, a German friend of mine, found a text where equal liberty written with two R's, equal liberty features central needs in the party debate. And there, of course, the symmetry is absolute. The symmetry is absolute. That is the idea that I developed as a motto, as an injunction. What we are claiming is not liberty without equality, but we're also not claiming equality without liberty. We're claiming both, despite the fact, which is of course simple, that they can and perhaps must clash or become in tension with one another. So this is not the constitutional idea, but this is the insurrectional idea. Of course, the insurrectional idea is not one that describes an established fact. It doesn't say, look around you, wherever you see liberty or forms of liberty, you'll also find forms of equality, and conversely, it says something like you can never escape this question. But of course, you escape it less and less if what you have in mind is not just a question of equality of formal rights or statuses, but something which, again, the contemporary English, speaks English in many cases, difficult to translate Portuguese language of emancipatory movements has repeatedly made use of, namely the idea of empowerment or the idea of collective agency. But some philosophers, like Spinoza, for example, on whom I've been working for some time, have a very direct evidence of that. Their idea of liberty is not just that you enjoy rights. Somebody wants to ask me questions about our relationship to our rights, to have rights, and so on. But it's the idea, of course, of creating collectively one's own individual rights. In this case, in as much, of course, as you enter or embark on some kind of insurrection in the broadest So I don't resolve anything, but I am strongly tempted to project onto Soraya, and I hope she will not find herself enslaved by that. The idea that her three notions, of which one comes from me, but not the others, comes from me or through me, etc., are a privileged way of problematizing the uncertain, I would say, articulation of three types of universality in the world in which we live today. I'm sorry for that absurd